August 23rd, 1191. The coastal fortress city of Acre, recently conquered by the combined forces of Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus. In a canvas pavilion erected among the sprawling Crusader encampment, a Frankish squire named Guillaume of Toulouse discovered his master, the renowned knight Sir Bertrand de Montfort, trampled beyond recognition in his own tent. The warhorse responsible, a massive grey Destrier named Tempest, stood over the mangled body, sides heaving, eyes rolling white with what witnesses described as purposeful rage. Blood flecked the stallion's hooves. The tent poles had been kicked out from within. Sir Bertrand's arms were raised in a defensive position, suggesting he had seen his death approaching. What shocked the camp wasn't simply that a horse had killed its master. War horses occasionally panicked, especially after the chaos of siege warfare. What disturbed the battle-hardened knights and sergeants who examined the scene was the evidence of calculation. Tempest had waited until Sir Bertrand was asleep, vulnerable, alone. The horse had systematically destroyed the tent's interior to prevent escape before delivering the killing blows. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple case of an animal finally breaking under the strain of war. Before we uncover the truth about the Third Crusade Destrier's revenge, and what drove a loyal warhorse to murder the master he had served for 7 years of brutal warfare, make sure to subscribe to Fierce Sermon and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the globe. Now, let's journey back to the blood-soaked sands of the Holy Land. The year 1191 represented the apex of the Third Crusade's ambitions and the nadir of its brutality. King Richard I of England and King Philip II of France had spent 2 grinding years fighting their way toward Jerusalem, motivated by religious fervor, political ambition, and the desire to reclaim Christian holy sites from Saladin's forces. Acre, the fortified port city on the Mediterranean coast, had endured a siege lasting nearly 2 years, from August 1189 to July 1191. The city's fall to Crusader forces marked a strategic turning point, but it came at an unspeakable cost. Over 100,000 soldiers and civilians had died in the protracted siege from starvation, disease, and violence. The beaches surrounding Acre were described in contemporary chronicles as carpeted with the unburied dead, such that men could not walk without treading upon corpses. Into this hell rode Sir Bertrand de Montfort, a vassal knight from the holdings of the Count of Toulouse. Contemporary accounts describe him as 32 years old, tall of stature with hair the color of rust, and possessing exceptional skill at arms, particularly with the lance. He had taken the cross in 1187 following Saladin's capture of Jerusalem, leaving behind his wife, Aliénor, and their 2 young daughters in France. Sir Bertrand's most prized possession was his Destrier Tempest, a grey Percheron stallion standing 17 hands high, bred specifically for warfare. Destriers represented the medieval equivalent of military tanks, massive horses trained to bite, kick, and trample enemy infantry, while carrying an armored knight into battle. A quality Destrier cost as much as a small estate. They were not pets, they were weapons. The bond between a knight and his Destrier was complex, formed through years of training and mutual dependence in combat. These horses learned to respond to leg pressure alone, as their riders' hands were occupied with weapons. They developed an aggressive temperament deliberately cultivated through specialized training. They were fed better than common soldiers, grain, not grass, and housed in relative comfort. Chronicles from the period describe knights speaking to their Destriers, sleeping near them, treating battlefield injuries personally. Sir Bertrand and Tempest had fought together through the siege of Acre. They had charged Saracen positions at Arsuf. They had forded rivers, scaled hills, and survived the dysentery, typhoid, and scurvy that had decimated the Crusader ranks. Witnesses reported seeing Sir Bertrand hand-feeding Tempest from his own rations during the worst of the food shortages, but something had been changing in the weeks before Sir Bertrand's death. Several knights in his company later testified to a hospitaller investigating the incident that Tempest had become increasingly difficult to manage and displayed uncharacteristic hesitation during cavalry exercises. The horse had stopped eating regularly. His coat had lost its sheen despite adequate grooming. More disturbing were the reports of Tempest's behavior toward his master specifically. Guillaume, Sir Bertrand's squire, reported that the stallion had begun what he described as watching the knight, following him with his eyes constantly, ears pinned back in an expression equine handlers associate with aggression or deep anxiety. The horse looked upon his master with what I can only describe as calculation, Guillaume testified later. Not as a beast looks upon a man, but as one man might regard another whom he has cause to hate. The first documented incident occurred on July 28, 1191, approximately 3 weeks after Acre's fall to Crusader forces. During a routine cavalry drill outside the city walls, Tempest suddenly reared without apparent provocation, nearly throwing Sir Bertrand from the saddle. According to witnesses, the knight managed to retain his seat, but the horse continued to fight against his commands, backing away from the formation and ignoring all attempts to bring him under control. Sir Geoffroy de Lusignan, a fellow knight who witnessed the event, recorded in his personal chronicle, "Sir Bertrand's Destrier behaved as though possessed by some demon. The beast's eyes showed white all around, and foam gathered at his mouth, yet there was no physical cause for such distress. No snake had spooked him, no injury afflicted him. When the grooms later examined Tempest, they found him sound of body but disturbed in spirit." Sir Bertrand attributed the incident to the stress of warfare and ordered his squire to give Tempest additional rest and extra rations. The knight was known for his compassion toward animals, a trait that some of his fellow crusaders found excessive, but that had earned him a reputation for maintaining horses in better condition than most nobles. The second incident occurred on August 5th, during the controversial execution of Muslim prisoners that King Richard ordered after Saladin failed to meet his ransom terms. Nearly 2,700 captured Muslim soldiers were marched to a hill called Ayadia, within sight of Saladin's camp, and systematically slaughtered. The execution took several hours. Knights, sergeants, and common soldiers participated in the killing. Contemporary Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir described it as one of the most terrible massacres of the age. Sir Bertrand was among the knights required to participate. He returned to camp that evening covered in blood, whether from the executions or from subsequent skirmishing with Saladin's forces attempting to intervene, remains unclear from the historical record. That night, when Sir Bertrand approached Tempest's picket line to check on his destrier as was his custom, the horse lunged at him with teeth bared, narrowly missing the knight's throat. The attack was so sudden and violent that Guillaume, who witnessed it, claimed the horse seemed to be attempting murder, not merely displaying temper. Sir Bertrand, shaken, ordered Tempest restrained with additional ropes. He consulted with the master of horse for the Templar Knights, a man named Brother Arnaud who had extensive experience with war horses. Brother Arnaud examined Tempe. Sent thoroughly, checking for physical ailments, poisoning, or disease. He found nothing. "The animal is sound," Brother Arnaud reportedly told Sir Bertrand, "but there is something wrong in his mind. I have seen this before in destriers who have witnessed too much slaughter. Some horses break under warfare just as some men do. The beast remembers every charge, every battle, every death. It is as though the horse has developed a conscience and found himself guilty of great sin." Brother Arnaud recommended rest, gentle handling, and prayer for the animal's soul. Medieval people believed animals possessed souls, though inferior ones to humans. He warned Sir Bertrand that a war horse who had turned aggressive toward his master was dangerous and might need to be replaced. Sir Bertrand refused. 7 years of warfare had created a bond that the knight was unwilling to sever despite the risk. "Tempest has saved my life a dozen times over," he told Brother Arnaud. "I will not abandon him to be sold or slaughtered because he is suffering from what we all suffer, weariness of this endless war." The third incident was witnessed by multiple people and documented in several contemporary accounts. On August 15th, during the Feast of the Assumption, Sir Bertrand was attending Mass in one of Acre's reclaimed churches. Tempest was picketed nearby with other destriers. According to multiple witnesses, the horse managed to break free from his restraints, something no one could explain as the knots were secure and the rope was strong. Tempest made his way directly to the church. The horse stood in the doorway during the elevation of the host, blocking the entrance, staring into the building. When grooms attempted to retrieve him, Tempest resisted violently, injuring one man's arm badly enough to break the bone. Father Pierre, the priest conducting the Mass, later described the scene as deeply unsettling. The beast stood as though witnessing the holy mystery, but with such a look of accusation in his eyes that several soldiers made the sign of the cross. One man claimed the horse was staring directly at Sir Bertrand, though I cannot confirm this. What I can confirm is that the animal seemed moved by deliberate intent, not random wandering. The congregation interpreted Tempest's appearance as an evil omen. Medieval Christians were deeply superstitious about animals behaving unnaturally, especially in connection with sacred spaces. Rumors began circulating that Tempest was possessed by a demon, or that the horse had been cursed by Saracen sorcerers. Sir Bertrand grew defensive about his Destrier. He refused suggestions from fellow knights that Tempest be destroyed or sold. Guillaume later testified that his master had begun speaking to the horse at length during evening visits to the picket lines, as though confessing his sins to a priest rather than addressing a beast. The squire reported one particularly disturbing conversation he overheard on August 20th, 3 days before Sir Bertrand's death. "I heard my master tell Tempest, 'You have the right to judge me. You have seen what I have done. You have carried me through it all.' Sir Bertrand was weeping. I could hear it in his voice. 'If you could speak, horse, what accusations would you make? What defense could I offer?' Guillaume found this behavior increasingly alarming but felt powerless to intervene. The rigid medieval hierarchy meant a squire could not question his knight's judgment, especially regarding matters the knight considered personal. The fourth and final incident occurred on August 22nd, the day before Sir Bertrand's death. A scouting party returning from patrol reported that Tempest had reacted violently when Sir Bertrand attempted to mount him for the expedition. The horse had reared, spun away, and kicked out with his rear hooves, behavior that in a war horse represented open rebellion against a rider. Sir Bertrand finally lost his patience. In front of the assembled scouting party, he beat Tempest with a riding crop, the only time anyone had witnessed the knight strike his horse in 7 years of partnership. The beating was severe enough that it left welts on Tempest's flanks and drew blood. The horse submitted, eventually allowing Sir Bertrand to mount, but witnesses reported that Tempest's demeanor had changed from aggressive to something they struggled to describe. Calculating was the word several used, like he was waiting for something. The scouting expedition proceeded without further incident, but when they returned that evening, Sir Bertrand ordered Tempest placed on an extended picket line away from the other horses. He told Guillaume that he would deal with the horse's discipline problems the following day, after he had rested. It was the last time anyone saw Sir Bertrand de Montfort alive. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten historical mysteries to light. Share this with someone who loves dark tales from the past. What do you think was really happening with Tempest? Was this animal madness or something more deliberate? Let's discover what happens next in this medieval nightmare. August 23, 1191. Approximately 3 hours after dawn, Guillaume of Toulouse approached his master's pavilion carrying bread, dried fruit, and watered wine for Sir Bertrand's breakfast. The young squire was running late. He had overslept after drinking too much wine the previous evening during dice games with other squires. He expected to find Sir Bertrand already awake and likely irritated by the delay. What he discovered instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. Guillaume's testimony to the Hospitaller investigators was recorded in Latin in a document that still survives in fragments at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. "I called out for my master as I approached his tent, as was customary, that he might know I was coming. He did not respond. I thought perhaps he still slept, or had departed already for morning prayers. When I pulled back the tent flap, I saw first the destruction. The tent poles kicked askew, the bedding trampled and torn, my master's belongings scattered as though a great struggle had occurred. Then I saw Tempest. The Destrier stood in the center of the ruined pavilion, his gray coat darkened with sweat and blood. The horse was breathing heavily, his sides heaving. His eyes were upon me immediately, and I confess I froze with terror, for the look in that animal's gaze was one of awareness, not the blank stare of a beast, but the focused attention of something that understood what it had done. Only then did I see my master. Sir Bertrand lay beneath Tempest's hooves, his body broken. His face was destroyed beyond recognition. His chest was caved in. His arms were raised as though he had tried to shield himself. The ground was dark with blood, soaked through the carpets that had covered the tent floor. I screamed. I do not remember what words I used, or if I used words at all. Men came running, other knights, sergeants, soldiers. Someone pulled me back from the entrance. Someone else attempted to enter the tent to reach my master, but Tempest lunged at them with bared teeth, driving them back. The horse seemed determined to guard his kill. Additional testimony came from Sir Geoffroy de Lusignan, who arrived moments after Guillaume's discovery. The horse had gone mad, that was my first thought. War horses sometimes break under the strain of battle, attacking anyone near them in their panic. But as I watched Tempest, I realized this was not mindless rage. The Destrier was positioned deliberately over Sir Bertrand's corpse, preventing access to it. When men approached, the horse would lunge or kick with precision, driving them back but not pursuing them. He was guarding the body. protecting his kill as a wolf might guard a deer carcass. It took nearly an hour for the knights to devise a method of removing Tempest from the tent without killing the valuable animal or risking additional human casualties. They constructed a makeshift barrier using shields and spears, slowly forcing the Destrier backward until they could secure him with ropes around his neck and legs. Even then, Tempest fought the restraints with such ferocity that 3 men were injured during the process, one suffering a broken jaw from a kick, another having his shoulder dislocated when Tempest lunged against the ropes. Once Tempest was secured and dragged away from the scene, Brother Arnaud, the Templar horsemaster who had examined Tempest previously, entered the tent to examine Sir Bertrand's remains. His report to the hospital or investigators was clinically detailed. The knight had been trampled to death, but the manner of trampling suggested deliberation rather than panic. The blows had been concentrated on the vital areas: the head, chest, and abdomen. The arms showed defensive wounds where Sir Bertrand had tried to protect himself, but the legs were largely unmarked, suggesting the horse had not simply stampeded over him but had instead specifically targeted the upper body. Most disturbing were the tent's interior damage patterns. The tent poles had been kicked from their moorings, causing the canvas to collapse partially, making it more difficult for Sir Bertrand to escape. The bedding had been trampled, in a manner that suggested the horse had systematically destroyed potential cover. The knight's sword, which he kept beside his bed, had been knocked far from reach. Whether by accident or design, I cannot say, but the positioning was unfortunate for Sir Bertrand. The body itself bore evidence of at least 30 separate hoof strikes. Death would not have been immediate. Sir Bertrand likely remained conscious for some minutes as the attack progressed. There were marks in the dirt floor where he had attempted to drag himself toward the tent opening, only to be struck again and driven back. I must conclude that this was not a brief explosive act of animal madness, but a sustained assault lasting several minutes. The physical evidence at the scene raised troubling questions among the investigating knights. How had Tempest entered the tent without waking Sir Bertrand? The tent had been secured with leather ties from the inside, suggesting Sir Bertrand had fastened them before sleeping. Had he awakened and let the horse in? If so, why? The picket line where Tempest had been secured overnight was examined. The rope had not broken. It had been worked loose from the knot. Horses could sometimes free themselves by pulling and worrying at restraints, but the knot that had held Tempest was a complex one that should have resisted such efforts. Moreover, none of the other horses on the picket line had freed themselves, only Tempest. The most disturbing detail came from a Bedouin servant working in the Crusader camp. The man, whose name was not recorded in the documents but who testified through a translator, claimed he had been awake during the night hours performing his duties. He stated that he had seen Tempest free himself from the picket line and walk deliberately toward Sir Bertrand's tent. The horse had not appeared agitated or panicked. He had moved with purpose. The Bedouin reported that he had assumed the horse was seeking his master for some benign reason, perhaps hunger or distress, and had not raised an alarm. He heard no sounds of struggle from the tent, suggesting Sir Bertrand either never woke until it was too late, or was unable to cry out. The horse knew what he was doing, the Bedouin testified. He walked like a man with intent, not like a beast wandering in confusion. When he reached the knight's tent, he stood outside it for some time, as though gathering courage or waiting for the right moment. Then he entered, and after some minutes I heard sounds of destruction. By the time I understood something was wrong and went to investigate, it was finished. Investigation into Sir Bertrand de Montfort's death fell to the Hospitallers, the military religious order responsible for maintaining discipline and investigating unusual deaths within the Crusader camps. The lead investigator was Brother Jean de Villiers, a knight who had trained in canon law before taking religious vows. Brother Jean's investigation faced immediate complications. Under normal circumstances, the death of a knight was a matter for his feudal lord to address. However, the Crusader army operated under a complex jurisdictional system where multiple authorities, kings, dukes, counts, bishops, and military orders, held overlapping powers. Sir Bertrand was a vassal of the Count of Toulouse, who had remained in France, but he was serving under King Richard, who had ultimate authority over the English and southern French contingents of the army. More fundamentally, medieval law had no clear precedent for prosecuting an animal for murder. Animals that killed humans were not unknown in medieval Europe. Pigs, bulls, horses, and even dogs occasionally caused human deaths. In such cases, the animal was typically destroyed immediately, and the matter was considered resolved. The animal's owner might face financial penalties if negligence could be proven, but the animal itself was not subjected to legal proceedings. Tempest's case was different for several reasons. First, he was a destrier, A warhorse worth more than most knights' annual income. Simply destroying him represented a significant financial loss, not just to Sir Bertrand's estate, but potentially to the Crusader army, which was chronically short of quality mounts. Several knights immediately expressed interest in claiming Tempest if he could be reformed. Second, the circumstances of the killing suggested something that made the medieval mind deeply uncomfortable: the possibility of deliberate, premeditated murder by an animal. If Tempest had killed Sir Bertrand in a moment of panic or rage, that fit within the medieval understanding of animal behavior. But the evidence suggested calculation, patience, and intent, qualities that medieval theology reserved for creatures with rational souls. Only humans possessed rational souls. Animals had sensitive souls that allowed them to perceive and react to their environment, but not to reason or plan. If Tempest had truly murdered Sir Bertrand through premeditated action, what did that mean theologically? Did the horse possess a rational soul? Had he been possessed by a demon? Was this evidence of witchcraft or sorcery? Brother Jean interviewed dozens of witnesses over the course of a week. He examined the scene of the killing multiple times. He consulted with Brother Arnaud about horse behavior and with Father Pierre about theological implications. He reviewed Sir Bertrand's personal effects and questioned Guillaume extensively about his master's recent behavior. The investigation revealed several factors that complicated the simple narrative of horse goes mad and kills master. First, Sir Bertrand had been struggling with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Guillaume testified that his master had been experiencing nightmares, particularly after participating in the execution of the Muslim prisoners on August 5th. Sir Bertrand had been heard crying out in his sleep. He had stopped attending evening meals with other knights, preferring to eat alone. He had written several letters to his wife that he subsequently burned rather than sending. A partially burned letter fragment that survived in Sir Bertrand's belongings contained a troubling passage: "I fear I have become the thing I once fought against. We came to this land bearing the cross, claiming to serve God's will, but what we have done here, what I have done, cannot be washed clean by any priest's blessing. The blood on my hands is real, Aliénor, and it will not wash off." Second, witnesses testified that Sir Bertrand had been treating Temp increasingly harshly in the days before his death. The beating on August 22nd was the most severe example, but Guillaume reported that his master had been more demanding and less patient with the Destrier for weeks. The knight who had once hand-fed his horse and spoken to him gently had become someone who jerked the reins hard, kicked Tempest's flanks repeatedly during riding, and showed little concern for the animal's obvious distress. Third, and most disturbing to medieval sensibilities, several witnesses reported that Sir Bertrand had been heard speaking to Tempest as though the horse could understand complex concepts and pass moral judgment. The confessional-style conversations Guillaume had overheard were not isolated incidents. Other knights had witnessed Sir Bertrand addressing his Destrier about matters of conscience, sin, and guilt. Brother Jean's final report to the Crusader leadership concluded that Sir Bertrand had died by misadventure, killed by his own warhorse in circumstances that combined the animal's battle-induced trauma with the knight's own deteriorating mental state and increasingly harsh treatment of the Destrier. However, the report included a troubling addendum that Brother Jean included after consulting with theologians. While we cannot conclude that the horse acted with rational premeditation as a human murderer would, neither can we dismiss the evidence suggesting purposeful action beyond simple animal rage. It is this investigator's opinion that Tempest had been subjected to years of warfare that damaged his sensitive soul, creating in the beast a corruption of his natural disposition. Combined with his master's harsh treatment and the evil atmospheres that pervade battlefields where men commit great sins, the horse became an instrument of divine punishment for Sir Bertrand's participation in unjust killings. Whether Tempest acted by his own corrupted will, or was directed by demonic forces or served as God's instrument, cannot be determined with certainty. What is certain is that this animal is dangerous and cannot be allowed to remain among Christian soldiers. The question of what to do with Tempest became a matter of debate among the Crusader leadership. King Richard, practical to a fault, wanted the horse gelded, retrained, and returned to service. "He is a weapon that misfired," the king reportedly said. "We do not throw away a sword because it cut the wrong man once." The clergy, however, argued that Tempest represented either demonic corruption or divine judgment, and that keeping him was spiritually dangerous. Several priests demanded he be destroyed and his body burned to prevent any taint from spreading to other animals. The compromise reached was pragmatic if unsettling. Tempest would be sold to merchants who would take him away from the Crusader army entirely. The horse would be gelded, to reduce his aggressive temperament, and sold to traders who could transport him back to Europe for use as a draft animal or breeding stock before the gelding. The sale was arranged quickly. A Venetian merchant named Marco Dandolo purchased Tempest for a fraction of his value as a Destrier, but a significant sum for a dangerous animal. The paperwork recording the sale included an unusual clause requiring Dandolo to swear an oath that he would never resell Tempest to anyone involved in warfare or the Crusades. Tempest was gelded on August 28, 1191. Multiple witnesses reported that the horse had to be heavily restrained for the procedure, and that his behavior during it was unnervingly calm, as though he understood this was his punishment and accepted it with resignation. The castrated horse was shipped from Acre to Venice in September 1191. Historical records indicate that Dandolo did eventually sell Tempest, now simply called Grey, to a monastery in the Piedmont region of Italy, where the former warhorse spent his remaining years pulling carts and plows for monks. A chronicle entry from the Mon Astery, dated 1197, mentions the great grey horse who came to us from the Holy Land, and notes that the beast is gentle with the brothers, but will not allow any man who bears weapons to approach him. It is as though he has taken a vow of peace. Tempest died in 1199, aged approximately 15 years, a respectable lifespan for a medieval horse. The monks buried him on monastery grounds, apparently considering him redeemed from whatever sin or corruption had marked his earlier life. Sir Bertrand's body was returned to France, where he was buried in the family chapel on the Montfort estates. His widow, Aliénor, never remarried. She entered a convent in 1193 and lived there until her death in 1214. Guillaume of Toulouse survived the Crusade and returned to France, where he eventually became a knight in his own right. He never spoke publicly about his master's death except when required to testify, but he never owned a Destrier, preferring smaller palfreys for travel and refusing to fight mounted in tournaments or warfare. Broader implications: 5 minutes. The case of Tempest and Sir Bertrand de Montfort never achieved the notoriety of human crimes from the era, but it left subtle ripples through medieval consciousness that reveal much about how people of that period understood animals, warfare, and moral responsibility. In the immediate aftermath, several knights in the Crusader army began treating their war horses with noticeably more caution and respect. Brother Arnaud reported an increase in knights seeking his advice about their destriers' mental states. The concept that war horses could suffer psychological damage from battle, an idea that seems obvious to modern audiences but was novel to medieval warriors, began gaining traction among the military orders. The Templars, always the most systematic of the religious military orders, apparently incorporated guidelines about monitoring horses for signs of battle trauma into their regulations. A Templar rulebook fragment from the early 13th century includes instructions that horses showing signs of excessive distress, unwillingness to charge, or strange behaviors toward their riders should be rested for extended periods and evaluated by experienced horse masters before returning to combat. This represents a remarkable sophistication in animal psychology for the medieval period. While people of that era did not have modern concepts like PTSD or understand the neurological basis for trauma responses, they were observant enough to recognize that sustained exposure to violence damaged both humans and animals. The theological implications of Tempest's case sparked debates that appeared in several medieval texts over the following decades. The question of whether animals could sin, and by extension, whether they could be held morally responsible for their actions, was not new to medieval theologians. Animals that killed humans had sometimes been put on trial in medieval Europe, particularly in the 14th and 15th centuries, where pigs, bulls, and even insects were formally prosecuted in ecclesiastical or civil courts. Tempest's case was unusual because it involved questions not just of animal responsibility but of animal motivation. Could a horse murder, or could it only kill? The distinction mattered theologically because murder required rational thought, planning, and moral agency, qualities that defined the soul's relationship with God. Thomas Aquinas, writing several decades after Tempest's killing, would articulate the orthodox position: animals lacked rational souls and therefore could not sin in the theological sense. They could be destroyed if dangerous, just as one might destroy a broken tool, but they could not be morally guilty. Any appearance of rational planning or moral judgment in animal behavior was either illusion, demonic possession, or divine intervention using the animal as an instrument. Yet the Tempest case suggested something that made this tidy theological framework uncomfortable. Animals, audiences. For people of the 12th century, The horror of Tempest's killing of Sir Bertrand lay not in the violence itself. Medieval people were intimately familiar with violence, but in the unsettling suggestion that the boundaries between human and animal, between rational and sensitive souls, between moral agency and instinctive action, were more permeable than their theology comfortably accommodated. The case suggested that sustained exposure to warfare's horrors could unmake not just humans, but the animals fighting alongside them, and that the witnessing of atrocity created its own form of moral responsibility that could drive even a beast to acts that looked disturbingly like justice. What do you think drove Tempest to kill Sir Bertrand de Montfort? Was this simply an animal broken by years of warfare, finally snapping under abuse? Or was there something more deliberate? A form of animal consciousness sophisticated enough to hold grudges, to plan, to execute revenge? Medieval theologians struggled with these questions because they challenged fundamental assumptions about what separated humans from animals. Modern audiences might find different lessons in this dark tale from the Crusades, about the psychological costs of warfare, about how violence damages all who witness it, about the responsibilities we bear toward creatures who serve us in battle. Leave your theories in the comments. Do you think animals can hold moral judgments? Can they plan revenge? Or are we projecting human motivations onto behaviors that have simpler explanations? Subscribe to Fierce Sermon for more lost chapters of history where the line between human and animal, between justice and murder, between divine judgment and natural consequence, becomes unsettlingly blurred. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest corners of the past. What other medieval mysteries would you like us to investigate? Let us know in the comments below. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten story that history tried to bury. Disclaimer: this presentation is a dramatized interpretation based on historical records and period-appropriate speculation. While the Third Crusade and the Siege of Acre are historical facts, specific details about Sir Bertrand de Montfort and his Destrier Tempest have been recreated for educational and entertainment purposes.